I'm Roy Williams. I'm President and CEO of the Greater Oklahoma City Chamber, and it is my pleasure to be a part of this partnership with the Neighborhood Alliance to bring you these 3 neighborhood films about Oklahoma City neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are very critical to a city that's transforming into a major metropolitan area, and I think you're going to see how that neighborhood impact has affected us. Our host for the series is Dr. Bob Blackburn. Bob is a renowned researcher, he's a renowned archiver, and he's a renowned speaker. You're going to hear him really bring you into the reality of what's happened in neighborhoods, what's happened in our history, and he has a profound way of making you feel like you were there. So we're excited, as I said, to be a part of this, but I think you're going to enjoy it even more than we are. So sit back and relax as you hear about the past, get a glimpse of the future, and an eye toward tomorrow from Dr. Bob Blackburn.
Hello, I'm Dr. Bob Blackburn, Executive Director of the Oklahoma Historical Society. Been working in the field of history now for over 40 years with a specialty in Oklahoma history, in particular Oklahoma City history. So I'm glad to be here today to really serve the Neighborhood Alliance, which has been an organization that has done so much for our city. And I'm going to talk about parts of Oklahoma City history that have impacted neighborhoods. Now, of course, in 20-minute segments, you can only talk about so much. So in each of these 3 segments that I'll do, I'm going to take 3 topics that have influenced neighborhood development and the quality of life since the very beginning of Oklahoma City history. So I'll be leaving out some things, but hopefully including those fundamental ones that will give everyone a place to start with a better understanding of not only our own neighborhoods, but how it all fits together into a community where we're all working together for a common goal. So first, let's start with the earliest days. Largely, this first presentation will go from 1889 to 1928. And in this time period, which really sets the DNA of Oklahoma City. So you have to go back to the beginnings and understand those pioneers, because we're standing on their shoulders. So each generation comes in, deals with what has happened, and these are the raw materials, the assets, and then we shape them in our own lifetimes. So we really have to understand some of the basic building blocks of neighborhoods in Oklahoma City and the factors that have shaped our neighborhoods. So first, let's start with the most fundamental of all, and the reason Oklahoma City is where it is, the way it looks, the way it has developed and expanded over the years, and that is transportation. And to understand transportation in Oklahoma, you have to start with steel rails. We think of our city today as a mobile community where we're in cars, we're zooming here and there, and if we get the whim to go to entertainment, to shop, whatever it is, we just hop in the car and go. It's not always been that way. That is more recent. You have to understand the steel rails. First, with railroads. Railroads were the key to commerce, for economic development, for getting people to come here, for people to be able to build their homes, to build their neighborhoods, to create the quality of life for everything else. And the first railroad was the Santa Fe, built through here 1885, 1887. It's the reason Oklahoma City is where it is. It's where the Santa Fe Railroad pierced the North Canadian River in a bend. Oklahoma City was built right there, close to water, because steam locomotives at the time had to have water about every 24 miles to refill, to create the steam, to drive the wheels of commerce. And so that's the very basic foundation of why we're here. Just on the western end of the cross timbers, because they didn't want to build a railroad through timbered area, a lot more work, so move out into the high plains. So if you're thinking about the differences between Oklahoma City and Tulsa, Tulsa is built in the foothills of the Ozarks. We're built in the foothills of the Great Plains. Geography is different. The water is different. The topography is different. The heights of trees. That has shaped much of the way we look and the way developers have expanded Oklahoma City. Well, of course, other railroads would come in. By 1900, we would have 5 trunk lines going in every direction. It made Oklahoma City the hub of this railroad network, going out to new land with farmers and ranchers prospering, going out to the oil fields where wealth was coming out of the ground. And then people were building communities along the railroads, connecting them with Oklahoma City. Manufactured goods coming in through Oklahoma City, raw materials going out through Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City, the fastest growing community in the nation from 1900 to 1910, going from 10,000 people roughly to 64,000 people. We were the boomtown. People like E.K. Gaylord was coming here. The Vose family, Richard and Chuck and the people we think of building the city, the Braniffs, you go on and on. They're coming in because of this miracle on the High Plains. Fort Worth is number 2, growing for the same reasons. But it goes back to transportation. How can people get products and people from point A to point B? Well, then you expand the steel rails to the streetcar system. And that starts with a developer named Anton Klassen, his partner and attorney John Chartel. They were buying land out beyond the limits of Oklahoma City. And Oklahoma City was a walking city from 1889 to 1902. If you wanted to build a home in a neighborhood, you had to live close enough to walk to shopping, to your work, to school, to all these things you would need in daily life. Well, Anton Klassen, smart investor, buying cheap land, as much as $100 an acre, way out in the country, as far north as 10th Street, and as far west as Klassen, present-day Klassen. So these are speculators buying land cheap. Plat for neighborhoods. No one wants to move that far out if you're going to have to walk to work, can't afford to take your horse into work. That all changes in 1902 when they get the first franchise for a streetcar line in Oklahoma City. And they have to get a franchise because the rails are laid on public right-of-way in the middle of the streets. So it becomes a public-private partnership, the first of many. We'll get all the way to the end of our series and talk about maps and historic preservation. Public-private partnerships. It's always been that way. So people who want to say this is the last frontier of free enterprise, and libertarians who say we don't need government, well, we've always had government, have always needed it, will always need this public-private partnership that works well for our quality of life. Streetcars are established. They finished them early in 1903, and so the streetcars allowed people to move out of the central city into distant neighborhoods where land was cheaper, houses were new. As far north as what is now Heritage Hills, Mesta Park, Gatewood, on the east side, Lincoln Terrace, into Capitol View, into these neighborhoods that were connected to the churches, to the shopping, to the schools, to all of this, the jobs, by the streetcar lines. And streetcar lines were not put in to make money on nickel fares. They were put in to make money in real estate development. So it's all intertwined in these early neighborhoods. Most of the historic preservation neighborhoods today in the 21st century all are connected by the streetcars. So it was definitely important. And we became a suburban community, not in 1957 with the interstates. We became a suburban community in 1903 with the streetcars. Suddenly, with our flat land, developers want to go where it's cheaper to put in roads and utilities, so they expand west and north. They're not going so much south because of the river and the flooding, and the North Canadian would continue flooding into the 1920s. One of the worst floods ever was 1925. A couple of feet of water, in most of downtown. So they're not going south. They're not going east because of the cross timbers. They're going west and north. So that's part of this direction of early development. And then, of course, the big change starting really by 1907, we see the early signs of it, and that is the age of the automobile and trucks. Whereas the early industrial districts, what we now call Bricktown, was developed because of its integration with railroads. You get a certain scale of warehouses. You get the brick streets. You get them around all these railroads on the east side where land was cheap and where the river was keeping people from developing neighborhoods. Well, now suddenly with cars and trucks, that's beginning to change the dynamics of where people live, how they get from here to there. And so, like for example, in 1915, Henry Ford, who's developed the Model T and releases that, I think the first year was 1908. And he gets the price of a Model T down to $400 or $500. Most people could afford it. Starts changing the way people move about and get things from point A to B. And in 1915, he decides to build an assembly plant in Oklahoma City to serve this region that's prospering. Today we call that the 21C Hotel, that old building. But it's changing everything. Suddenly people do not need the street rails to develop the next neighborhood. G.A. Nichols, one of those early developers, takes advantage of that and goes 3 miles from the nearest development, detaches his idea from the streetcars and builds Nichols Hills, 1928. And thereafter, neighborhoods can be developed not because of the relationship with streetcars, but the opportunity to get there in cars, in buses, and trucks serving us. And that would continue to have its impact on Oklahoma City. Well, next, you really need to understand the basic DNA of our economic livelihood since 1889, and that can only be described as boom and bust. The boom and bust cycle has defined Oklahoma's trajectory in terms of growth, contraction, challenges, opportunities, when people come here as a land of immigrants, when we're building infrastructure, when we're looking for more water, when we're looking for more police protection or fire protection or infrastructure. It all revolves around the economic trends. Well, Oklahoma City was founded with the greatest boom in American history called the Land Run of 1889. A city literally born grown. One day, April 21st, no legal ownership of land. April 22nd, we think somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people say this is our land. And then all the 160-acre farmsteads of the entire unassigned lands claimed. And so you go from public ownership to private ownership in one day. Well, the people who experienced that, the people like Charlie Colcord and Angelo Scott and some of these early pioneers would never forget it. It was life-defining. If that miracle could happen once, maybe it can happen again. We call that the spirit of '89. Now, the spirit of '89 is beginning to fade a little bit because of the generations that have come since, but it would remain a strong influence in Oklahoma City. So when things start going well, so let's say the price of cotton goes from 10 cents to 20 cents in a couple of years because of demand in Europe for World War I, or the demand for oil starts going up because of the Henry Fords of the world creating this demand with their cars. Well, Oklahoma City people tend to jump on the bandwagon and say, hey, here's our next miracle. Let's invest everything we can. Let's go all in. Let's mortgage everything we have. Let's take this risk, which is the heart of free enterprise, and go all in. And so every boom that we would have where things are going well, the attitude is it's always going to be good. It will never come to an end. So let's go and go, well, this created this roller coaster effect in our economy. So we get from that boom in 1889, a depression in 1893, a national stock market crash, they call it the crisis of 1893. All the banks fail, price of land craters, no one's coming. Well, here come the railroads, here comes agricultural prosperity, and the rains come back in 1897 and 98. Here comes the Frisco Railroad, here come the Katy Railroads. Suddenly the boom. Everyone is going in, developing new neighborhoods. Well, overdevelopment, and then we get a crash in 1911 where we have a drought. Farmers lose their crops. The price of livestock goes through the floor, and suddenly no one can pay their bills, bankruptcies, failures. Do we learn a lesson? No. The next boom begins with oil in the 1920s, and here we go on this ride again. It would happen lastly in the 1970s with deep gas exploration in western Oklahoma. The first exploration in the deep gas at Deep Anadarko would be in the 1960s. In the 1970s, with regulation of shallow natural gas, releasing deep gas from price control, federal price controls, suddenly this boom Everyone in Oklahoma City wanted to be a landman. Everyone wanted to have an oil well. Thought it would last forever. It didn't. We hit the crash in '82, steep descents in '85. We didn't recover until almost 2000. That is the nature of our economy, boom and bust. Now, the ascents have become less over time, and the descents have become less over time. We've learned some lessons. The nature of oil and gas has changed. The nature of capital investment has changed, which is flattening out the curve somewhat. But we need to always remember that all of this time we've been living on this boom and bust cycle, and our neighborhoods have expanded along with it, and they've contracted along with that same cycle. Then lastly, to conclude this, to give us kind of a blueprint around which everything is developed, is the park system. Fortunately for Oklahoma City today, this growth period from 1898 to 1910 comes along just at the time that the parks movement is really underway across the country and even in Europe. This is the age of wanting to get back into nature. It's the age of discovering germs, of scientific discoveries, and people are saying we need to get outdoors. We need to fight back against this urbanization and the density that you're seeing in the big cities like New York and Chicago and London and Paris and around the world. How can we have a more healthy environment? Well, part of that is let's provide parks in urban settings. New York City, you see it with Central Park. You see it in Chicago. You see it in other communities. Kansas City is a good example. Well, here in Oklahoma City, by 1909, during this boom, the people of Oklahoma City look around and say, well, we're becoming more dense, we're growing. How can we maintain our connection with nature and a healthy lifestyle? Parks. And so a Parks Commission is created through the city government. The Parks Commission looks around and in tune with the boom and bust cycle. Instead of just saying, let's build a park along the river, I say, oh no. Even though we're only a community approaching, 50,000, 60,000 people, we're going to build 4 parks. And we're going to connect it with a grand raceway. This is the age of automobiles. Let's have a place where we can get out and drive in the country and have this freedom. And so the city proposes a bond issue. The people of Oklahoma City approve it, and they buy the right-of-way and the parks that we now know as Will Rogers Park, as Lincoln Park, Woodson Park, and Trosper Park. All that land was bought in 1 year. Today, if the city tried to do that, it'd take a decade to get it accomplished. But they did it in 1 year, and they connected it with what they called the Grand Boulevard. It was to be a grand raceway. It's the same year that people in Indiana create the Indianapolis 500. So everyone is thinking about cars and racing and competition, but here they combine it with parks. And that almost creates the 4 corners of the city around which other neighborhoods would develop. And then the park system would keep expanding until we keep going out with parks. And then coming back with pocket parks, with developers putting aside land like I.M. Putnam would put aside what he called Putnam Park on Classen Boulevard at 36th Street. We now call it Memorial Park. 1907, the Parks Movement. People like Anton Classen, G.A. Nichols putting aside parkland, what we now call Winans Park, what we call Harn Park, what we call some of this green space in the Paseo. And this is all happening just as we are developing the DNA of our community that would carry on generation to generation, providing a framework around which other things are happening. So it's no accident that MAPS 3 had a major component for a park. People here have always appreciated parks, and we still want parks today. MAPS 4 had a parks component. How can we do more with neighborhood parks? How can we encourage developers to do it the right way, to set up a park that can be sustainable, not just enough to sell a bunch of lots and build homes, but how can we make that part of this story of a community? So from 1889 to 1928, most of the basic DNA, the footprint, the blueprint of Oklahoma City is established. There will be other booms and busts. There will be other elements that change all of this. but we have started with the development of Oklahoma City neighborhoods.
We've heard from our past, and now it's time for us to look into our future. I'm Georgie Rasco. I'm the Executive Director of Neighborhood Alliance, and for the past 45 years, we've been there working with neighborhood leaders. Currently in 2020, we have over 600 neighborhood associations in the Oklahoma City area working hard to continue to build the city. So we have a lot to build on and a lot to take us into the future. It's up to us now to continue to build this great city. Who knows, some of you might be on the future films about how we made this city great. Thank you, and call on Neighborhood Alliance whenever you need us.